Inside, Lumière, the most expensive restaurant in the city, every fork moved in slow silence until Alara Voss stopped walking. The 32-year-old billionaire draped in black silk, the woman whose face had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times this year, simply froze in the middle of the dining room. Not because of the senator at table 4, not because of the cameras hiding behind the orchids. She stopped because of a man in a faded gray shirt at a forgotten corner table, carefully cutting pasta into tiny pieces for a little girl whose laughter cut clean through the marble hall. Her 6-year-old son tugged her sleeve and whispered something no one expected to hear from a child raised in glass towers. "Mom, I want to sit with them." And the woman who never bent for anyone slowly, quietly walked toward that corner table. The doorman of Lumière bowed as the Blacktown car pulled away, and Alara Voss stepped onto the red carpet without looking at him. She rarely looked at the people who opened doors for her. It was not cruelty. It was a habit she had built carefully the way other women built skincare routines, a small discipline of distance that kept her safe inside the role she had chosen. Her phone buzzed against her palm. She glanced down. A single line from Marcus Sterling, vice chairman of her own board. Tomorrow's meeting should be interesting. No greeting. No emoji. Sterling had been with her father before her, a man who wore charcoal suits and smiled like a knife. Alara read the message twice, then locked the screen. Whatever he was building, she would dismantle it before lunch. She always did. Beside her, Evan walked with his small hand tucked inside the cuff of his sweater. He did this often, though Alara had never noticed. He gripped the fabric tight, counted his steps in groups of 4, and pressed his thumb against the second button of his shirt whenever the world grew too loud. Tonight the world was very loud. Chandeliers like frozen constellations, low jazz curling between the tables, the perfume of women who had nothing to do but be perfumed. A photographer flashed once from behind the floral wall. Alara did not flinch. She had agreed to a controlled return to the public eye after the quiet, ugly divorce, and Lumière had been chosen for her by a publicist who understood lighting. Tonight, she was supposed to look human, approachable. A mother dining with her son. The maître d'hôtel guided them toward the curtained alcove reserved for guests whose names did not appear on reservation lists. Alara walked through the dining room with the indifference of someone who owned the building's mortgage, which in fact she did. And then Evan stopped. It was such a small movement that the maître d' continued walking for 3 steps before realizing he had lost the boy. Alara felt the tug at her sleeve before she heard her son make a sound. She looked down, irritated for a half-second, and then saw what he was seeing. In the corner of the dining room at a table that had clearly been given to the wrong reservation, a man was cutting pasta. He wore a gray button-down that had been washed so many times the color had given up. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His hair, dark and a little too long, fell forward as he leaned over the plate. Across from him, a girl of about 7 sat with her napkin tucked into the collar of a yellow dress that had once belonged to someone older. She was talking with her whole face, eyebrows up, mouth open mid-sentence, hand sketching something invisible in the air, and the man was listening as if she were delivering the most important speech of the century. He cut her pasta into small, even pieces. He did not interrupt. He nodded at the right moments. When she laughed, he laughed a beat later, quieter the way a man laughs when he is mostly just relieved that his child is happy. That laugh, that small, unhurried thing was the first thing Alara had heard in weeks that was not designed to be heard by her. Evan tugged her sleeve again. "Mom." She glanced down. Her son was staring at the corner table with an expression she did not recognize on his face. Hunger, perhaps, but not for food. "Mom," he said, again softer. "I want to sit with them." The maître d', having retraced his steps, cleared his throat delicately. "Ms. Voss, the alcove is prepared. Please." His eyes flicked briefly and apologetically toward the corner table, a silent message that read, "That table was a mistake. We are addressing it. Please move on." Across the room, a woman in pearls. Eleanor Harding, an old friend of Alara's late mother, had already noticed Alara and was lifting her hand in a slow, regal wave. The cameras behind the orchids had also noticed. Alara felt the architecture of the evening sliding into place around her. The wave returned. The alcove entered the photographs, filed the daily story written. She looked down again at her son. Evan was pressing his thumb against the second button of his shirt. His knuckles were white. She had not known he did that. She had not known he did any of it. The counting, the cuff gripping the way he was looking now at another father feeding another child, as though watching a country he had only read about in books. Something inside her chest, something she had taught herself not to listen to, made a sound like ice cracking under a footstep. "Change of plans," Alara said quietly to the maitre d'. The man blinked. "Madam, we'll sit at that table, the corner one." "That table is, madam. There is a guest already seated. We can move him without any inconvenience, of course, to a place more suitable." "You will not move him." Her voice did not rise. It rarely needed to. "Add 2 chairs. Bring our menus there." The maitre d' opened his mouth, closed it, and bowed. Alara took her son's hand. It was the first time that evening she had taken it without being prompted by a photographer. Evan looked up at her, startled, and then a small, careful smile broke across his face, the smile of a child who had not until that moment fully believed his mother could hear him. They crossed the dining room together. The man in the gray shirt looked up when their shadow fell across his plate, and Alara watched the recognition happen on his face in 3 stages. First, simple curiosity. Who is this woman? Who is this boy? Second, the slow registration of her face from somewhere, a magazine, a screen, a building. Third, a careful neutral stillness, the kind of stillness men in his position learned to wear when the wealthy unexpectedly entered their orbit. He stood half a beat too late and pulled out the chair beside his daughter. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think there's been some confusion with the seating. We can—" "There hasn't been any confusion," Alara replied. "My son would like to eat dinner here, if that's all right with you." The girl in the yellow dress had already turned to Evan, her face open as a window. "I'm Lily. I'm 7. My dad said I could have dessert tonight because I got all A's on my report card. Do you like chocolate cake?" Evan, who had spoken perhaps a dozen sentences in public over the past year, looked at her as though she had just performed a magic trick. "Yes," he whispered. "Sit by me," Lily said, patting the chair. "He cuts mine, but I can cut yours if you want. I'm good at it now." The man let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. "Daniel," he said, offering his hand to Alara. His palm was warm and rough at the heel, the hand of a man who used it. "Daniel Hayes. And that's Lily, as you've heard." "Alara." She did not add the surname. For one strange, weightless moment, she did not want to. They sat. The waiter arrived, his eyebrows pulled tight with confusion, and took their orders with the stiffness of a man unsure whether he was witnessing a charity event or a scandal. Across the table, Evan's plate of pasta arrived. He stared at it. He picked up his fork. He set it down. He had never in his life cut his own food. There had always been someone, a nanny, a chef, a hand belonging to a woman his mother paid to do it for him. His thumb moved toward the second button of his shirt. Daniel saw it. Alara did not understand how the gesture was so small, but the man across from her saw it, and without making it a thing, without making her son feel watched, he slid Evan's plate gently toward himself. "Mind if I help?" Daniel asked. His voice was easy conversational, as though he were asking to borrow salt. Evan looked at his mother. Alara could not speak. She simply nodded. Daniel cut the pasta into small, even pieces. the same way he had cut Lily's. No ceremony, no pity, just a man doing a small thing well for a child who needed it. He slid the plate back. There you go, buddy. And Alara Voss, who that morning had signed a deal worth $400 million without flinching, sat at a corner table in the most expensive restaurant in the city and felt for the first time in years that she had no idea what to do with her hands. The first bite of pasta had not yet reached Evan's mouth when Eleanor Harding's pearls came clicking across the marble. Mrs. Harding moved through Lumière like an aircraft carrier, through a harbor slowly, deliberately expecting smaller vessels to clear her path. She had buried 2 husbands and several reputations, and she had been a regular at this restaurant since before Alara was born. She stopped beside the corner table and laid a heavily ringed hand on the back of Alara's chair, as though staking a claim. "Alara, darling." Her voice was loud enough to carry to the next 3 tables, which was precisely the volume she intended. "I almost didn't recognize you over here. Whatever are you doing in this part of the room?" Her gaze drifted across Daniel, as though across a stain on the carpet, then settled on Lily's yellow dress with a small surgical smile. "Charity work is so commendable, dear. But really, there are places for that. The church, the shelter on 5th. Not Lumière." The waiter had been standing 2 paces behind her, summoned by some invisible signal of the wealthy. He took his cue, stepped forward with clipboard in hand, and addressed Daniel without quite looking at him. "Sir, I do need to mention the restaurant has a dress code. We require collared formal wear. I'm afraid the table you were originally given was an error of the front of house, and..." Daniel's hand was already moving to the napkin in his lap. His shoulders had folded inward by half an inch, a movement so practiced it was almost invisible. He had heard this speech, or speeches like it, in 100 quieter forms, at the doors of urgent cares that did not take his insurance, at the counters of schools that did not believe his daughter belonged there, in the eyes of cashiers who counted his change twice. He set the napkin on the table and began to rise. "It's all right," he said quietly to Lily. "Honey, get your coat." Lily did not move. She looked at her father, then at Mrs. Harding, then at the waiter. Her small jaw set the way a small jaw can only set when it has learned the world too early. "My daddy," she announced, in a voice clear enough to silence the next 2 tables, "is the best man in this room." Mrs. Harding's smile twitched. Across the table, Evan slid out of his chair and walked the 3 steps around to stand beside Lily. He took her hand. His other thumb was still pressed against his shirt button, and his breath was short, but he had moved without being asked, and that was the part that mattered. "I think so too," Evan said. His voice was thin, but it carried. The dining room had gone quiet in that particular way. Restaurants go quiet, not silent, but listening. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. A senator at table 4 turned very slightly in his seat. Alara stood. She did not stand quickly, and she did not stand loudly. She stood like she stood in boardrooms when she was about to end a man's career, which is to say, almost gently. "Eleanor." Mrs. Harding's chin lifted. "Yes, dear. You have just humiliated my son in front of me." Alara's voice was level, almost conversational, which made it worse. "I will remember that." The pearls clicked once as Mrs. Harding swallowed. She opened her mouth, decided against whatever she had been about to say, and turned with the slow precision of a woman who had just realized she was being looked at by people whose opinions she would later need. She walked back to her own table without another word. The waiter mumbled something about checking on their entrees and disappeared toward the kitchen. Daniel sat down slowly. He looked across the table at Alara, as though he had not until that moment been entirely certain what kind of woman she was. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes." Alara reached for her water glass. "I did." She was lifting it when the front door of Lumière swung open hard enough to be heard at the corner table. Nora, Alara's executive assistant, the only person in the company Alara trusted, to know her schedule down to the bathroom break, crossed the dining room without acknowledging a single host. Her coat was unbuttoned. Her hair, normally pulled into a severe twist, had come loose on one side. She reached the table and bent close to Alara's ear, but her voice was tight enough that Daniel heard most of it anyway. Sterling called an emergency board meeting. Tonight. He's invoking the clause. Alara's face did not change. She had a face built for not changing. On what grounds? Psychological instability. Post-divorce. He's saying you've been making erratic decisions and that there's a duty of care to the shareholders. Nora's eyes flicked toward Evan and away again. He has 8 signatures already. He needs 11. Alara set her water glass down. She had not yet taken a sip. She had not, in fact, eaten anything since a small black coffee at 6 o'clock that morning, before the $400 million signing, before the press call, before the car to Lumière. She had not noticed. She rarely noticed. She stood. The dining room tilted. It was a small tilt, at first, the kind a person can pretend is just the angle of a chair. She put one hand on the table. The marble floor seemed to rise toward her in a slow, polite way. Somewhere very far off, Evan was saying, Mom, and Lily was saying something to Daniel, and a phone somewhere 2 tables over, was already lifting into the air, with its little dark eye opening. Alara felt her knees go. She fell forward, struck the edge of the table with her temple, and the dining room went bright white, and then very dark. She was aware distantly of the sound her own body made hitting the floor. The first voice she heard afterward was not Nora's. Nora was shouting for someone to call an ambulance. The maitre d' was shouting at a busboy. Her security detail, 2 men in earpieces who were paid extremely well to be useful, in exactly this kind of moment, were standing 3 feet away with their hands at their sides, looking at each other. The voice she heard was Daniel's. On her back. Now. Lift her feet. She felt hands under her ankles, firm and unhurried. She felt another hand at her wrist, 2 fingers pressed against the pulse point, with the practiced light pressure of someone who had done this in much worse rooms than this one. Orange juice, Daniel said not loudly to the waiter who had returned. And 4 packets of sugar, right now. Don't ask, just go. The waiter went. Stay with me, Alara. Daniel's voice was close to her ear, low-level, the voice of a man who had spoken to people through worse fogs than this one. You're hypoglycemic. Your sugar dropped. You're going to be all right. Open your eyes for me. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the underside of a chandelier fractured into 1,000 small lights by the water in her eyes. The second thing she saw was Daniel's face very close, looking at her, not with pity, and not with awe, and not with calculation, but with the simple, undivided attention of a man whose entire job in that moment was her. The orange juice arrived. Daniel tore the sugar packets with his teeth, dumped them in, swirled the glass with one practiced motion, and slid a hand under her shoulders to lift her. Small sips, don't rush it. She drank. Within 2 minutes, she would later check the timestamp on the phone footage, which would by then be on every screen in the country she was sitting up. Her hands were trembling. Her temple was bleeding in a thin, neat line down to her jaw, and Daniel was already pressing a folded white napkin to it. The security detail had finally moved. Nora was on the phone. The maitre d' was apologizing to no one in particular. Alara looked at Daniel. He looked back at her, and for the first time that evening she understood that someone was seeing her. Not the company, not the face on the cover of the magazine, not the woman who had just told Eleanor Harding she would remember, but her. Just her. A woman who had skipped lunch and hit her head on a table. Can you stand? Daniel asked. Give me a moment. Take all of them you need. The manager of Lumière, who had finally understood which of his guests was about to ruin or save his career, offered them the private dining room on the 2nd floor. Nora hustled the children up the stairs ahead of them. Lily had taken Evan's hand, without being asked, and Evan was letting himself be led, which was perhaps the most extraordinary thing Alara had seen all night. The private room had heavy curtains, and a long table, and a fire that someone had lit too quickly. Alara sat in the chair Daniel pulled out for her. Nora produced a small leather first aid kit from her work bag, the one she carried for Alara's office, where 80-hour weeks made nosebleeds and migraines, and occasionally fainting interns a part of the calendar. Daniel used the antiseptic and the butterfly closures to clean and shut the cut on her temple, working with a quiet economy of motion that made the gesture look like nothing at all. Nora was on the phone in the corner, voice low and rapid, trying to push the board meeting back by an hour. Alara watched Daniel's hands. "You've done this before," she said. "A few times. More than a few." His eyes were on the cut, checking it, as a man checks a thing he understands. "I was a doctor," he said at last. "Trauma, Army, 8 years. She let that sit between them. "And now I clean floors at a hospital in Riverton 3 nights a week, and I stock shelves at a hardware store on the weekends. Lily is in 2nd grade. She likes horses, and she's going to be a veterinarian, although last month she also wanted to be a pirate, so we're keeping our options open." He said it lightly, but his hand wasn't light. It was steady on the gauze, and his eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment. And Alara, who had built an entire career on reading the small tells of men across tables, understood that she was being told only the surface of a much deeper thing. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her. She braced for the polite deflection. "The long story. The another time. The wall." But Daniel set the gauze down and folded his hands on the table. And when he spoke, it was the voice of a man who had told this story exactly once to himself, every night for 3 years. "My wife died in a car accident. I was in the passenger seat. I was conscious. I had everything I needed in the trunk. I always carried a kit. I got to her, and I worked on her, and I could not stop the bleed. She died on the side of Route 9 while I had both hands inside her chest." The fire in the grate made a small sound. "After that," Daniel went on, "I couldn't put the coat back on. I'd get to the locker room and my hands would shake so badly I'd drop the badge. So I stopped trying. I told myself someone else would do it better. I started cleaning floors because no one dies if you miss a spot." Alara did not look away. She had spent her adult life making sure no one ever saw her need anything. She had been told by therapists she paid and lovers she did not keep that this was a problem. She had filed those notes the way she filed all unwelcome information, thoroughly and at the bottom of a drawer. She looked at this man, this stranger in a faded shirt, this trained physician scrubbing toilets, in a town she had probably never driven through, and she heard herself speak before she had decided to. "I don't know what Evan likes to eat." The words were so small, they barely made it across the table. Daniel did not flinch. He did not soften his face into pity. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her on the floor of the restaurant, directly without ornament. "Then start asking," he said. Nora came off the phone with the look of someone who had just been told the building was on fire. "It's out," she said. "The video. Someone at the next table had it up before the ambulance was even called. Sterling already has it. He's circulating a statement, visible mental breakdown in a public venue, urgent question of fitness board has a fiduciary duty. The meeting's been moved up. 90 minutes. Alara reached for her water. Her hand was still trembling. She watched it tremble as though it belonged to another woman. She had built the company from the wreckage of her father's last decade. She had taken a holding firm bleeding out in 2 divisions and turned it into a $40 billion diversified portfolio in 7 years. She had done it without crying in any bathroom anyone could name. And tonight, because she had not eaten lunch, because a small woman in pearls had insulted her son, because a man she did not know had cut her son's pasta tonight on a video she had not consented to. She was about to lose all of it. Evan was asleep on the small sofa by the fire. Lily had curled up beside him with her head on his shoulder, the yellow dress riding up over her knee. Daniel had laid his jacket over both of them, without seeming to think about it. Alara looked at her son. She looked at her hands. She looked at Daniel. "What do I do?" she asked. Her voice was not the voice of a CEO. It was not the voice that had told Eleanor Harding, "I will remember." It was thinner than that, and younger, and Alara hated the sound of it almost as much as she needed the answer. Daniel sat down across from her. He did not reach for her hand. He understood somehow that she was not a woman who could be touched in the middle of being broken. "You don't fight a coup with power," he said. "Power is what he's using. He has the cameras. He has the narrative. If you walk into that room and try to outpower him, he wins because he prepared, and you didn't." She waited. "You fight it with the truth," Daniel went on. "And the truth is, you had hypoglycemia. That's medicine, not madness. I can prove that part. I have the credentials, and I have eyes that know what they saw. The rest of it, the company, the board, whatever this Sterling has been building for however long he's been building it, that's not mine to fight." He met her eyes. "That part," he said, "you have to stand up and do yourself." The fire snapped. Somewhere below them in the dining room she had walked through 2 hours ago without looking at the doorman. The orchestra of glasses and forks went on as if nothing had happened. Alara set her trembling hand flat on the table. She watched it. She willed it to be still. It wasn't still yet. But she was going to make it still. She turned to Nora without lifting her eyes from her own hand. "Get me the file on Sterling, the one I told you to start keeping in March." Nora's mouth opened. "You knew." "I suspected." Alara's voice was returning slowly from wherever it had gone. "Anyone who sends a text, like the one he sent me at 7 o'clock tonight, has already counted his signatures twice. Bring me everything. The vendor contracts, the offshore registrations, the email metadata you flagged. All of it." "Ma'am, some of it isn't. Bring it anyway." Nora left at a run. Daniel watched her go, then looked back at Alara. There was something new in his face. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to recognition. "You were already building a case. I build cases on everyone." Alara pressed a fresh gauze pad against her temple. "I just didn't think I'd have to file this one tonight." She looked at her son once more, asleep under a stranger's jacket. Then she looked at the stranger. "If I'm going to walk into that boardroom in 90 minutes, she said, I need to walk in standing. Will you come with me?" Daniel did not answer right away. He looked at Lily, at the rise and fall of her small back against Evan's. "They can't be alone," he said. "Nora will stay with them. There's a security detail on this floor, and I'll have 2 more sent up before we leave. They will not be alone for a second." He looked back at Alara. "Then yes," Daniel said. "I'll come." She nodded once the smallest possible movement, and felt for the first time since the chandeliers of Lumière had burned above her like frozen stars, that she might just possibly still be the woman who had walked in through that door. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Voss Tower had been designed by Alara herself 6 years ago, when she had taken the chair from her father's old men. She had chosen the long walnut table because walnut darkened with age, the way good decisions did. She had chosen the windows because she wanted whoever sat at that table to remember they could be seen. Tonight, the windows reflected 14 people who were already in their seats when she walked in. She walked in slowly. The cut at her temple was clean, butterflied, shut the small white strip, the only visible reminder of what had happened 90 minutes ago. Nora had brought a fresh blouse from the office 2 floors down. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands at her sides were no longer trembling, or if they were, no one was going to see it. Daniel walked in behind her, in the same gray shirt he had worn to Lumière. A murmur ran through the room. Marcus Sterling stood at the far end of the table beside a wall-mounted screen, a remote in one hand, and a thin smile on his face. He had loosened his tie just enough to suggest he had been working late, but not so much as to suggest he had been working hard. Alara. His voice was warm. It was always warm. We were beginning to worry. No, you weren't, Alara said pleasantly. She took her seat at the head of the table. Daniel sat in the empty chair to her right, the chair normally reserved for outside counsel. Several board members glanced at him, at his shirt, at his hands, and then more carefully at Alara's face. Sterling clicked the remote. The screen filled with the video. It was worse than she had expected, not because of what it showed, but because of how it had been cut. Someone had trimmed the opening so that the audience did not see her stand up. They saw only her, swaying, only her hand, reaching for the table, only her body striking the floor. A red circle had been added around her temple. A second clip had been spliced in beside it, a still photograph of her leaving a psychiatrist's office in Midtown, taken 3 months ago, which she had assumed at the time had been a coincidence. Sterling let the loop play twice. "Colleagues," he said, when he finally muted it. "I take no pleasure in this. Alara has been a strong leader. But the events of tonight, taken together with the pattern of the last several months, the rescheduled meetings, the unscheduled medical appointments, the increasingly emotional tone of internal correspondence, leave us with a duty we cannot avoid." He set the remote down. "I move that the board exercise Section 4 of the bylaws and place the chief executive on indefinite medical leave, with operational authority transferred to the office of the vice chair, effective immediately." A man 2 seats down from Sterling Harold Brennan, who had been on the board since Alara's Father's Day, cleared his throat. "Seconded." The room went very still. Alara folded her hands on the table. "Before we vote," she said, "I'd like to introduce the gentleman to my right. He's not counsel. He's a doctor. And he was the first medical professional to reach me when I collapsed this evening." She turned her head just slightly. Daniel stood. The shirt was very faded under the conference room lights. He did not seem to notice. He set a single folded sheet of paper on the table, a printout of his active state medical license, which Nora had pulled from the public physician registry. On the way over, and he began to speak, and within 40 seconds the room understood that the man in the faded shirt knew exactly what he was talking about. He walked them through the video frame by frame. The pallor, the dilation of the pupils visible in a still he asked Sterling to pause on. The specific way Alara's knees had buckled, not a faint. He said not a seizure, not a stroke. A textbook, vasovagal collapse secondary to acute hypoglycemia, in a patient who had not eaten in over 14 hours and was under significant adrenergic load. He said all of this without notes. He said it the way a man reads a book he has read many times. "I treated her on the floor with oral glucose," Daniel said. "She was conscious and oriented within 90 seconds. She was standing within 15 minutes. Any physician in this room, and I see at least 2 of you on the medical advisory board, will tell you the same thing if you call them right now." He sat down. Sterling's smile had thinned by a millimeter. "That is one interpretation," he said. "I'm sure it's a sincere one, but the question before us is not the medical event itself. It is the broader pattern of Marcus." Alara's voice cut across his like a blade across silk. "Let's talk about your broader pattern." She opened the folder Nora had set in front of her. She did not raise her voice. She rarely did. She simply began in the same level tone she had used to tell Eleanor Harding she would remember to lay out the contents of the file her assistant had been quietly building since March, back when Alara had first noticed that one of Sterling's discretionary line items had been routing through a shell company in Delaware that shared a registered agent with a competitor's holding firm. She named the shell She named the agent. She named the competitor. She named the dates. She named the email Sterling had sent to a partner at that competitor in April, in which he had referred to her, Alara, by a word she did not repeat in the boardroom, and had outlined in 3 short paragraphs the precise mechanism by which he intended to engineer a public incident, a media cycle, and a Section 4 vote no later than the end of the calendar year. She named the bank account that had been receiving quarterly transfers beginning the previous September from the competitor's offshore arm into a trust whose sole beneficiary was Sterling's youngest son. 3 deposits, each one large enough to mean exactly one thing. She set the documents on the table one at a time. The room did not breathe. Harold Brennan stared at the email printout in front of him for a long moment, then quietly, almost apologetically, withdrew his second. Sterling's hand was on the back of his chair. His knuckles had gone white. These are out of context. These are... Marcus. Alara looked at him for the first time in the conversation. You wrote them. She let that sit. Then she looked slowly at each face around the table. You can vote me out tonight, she said. I'll be honest with you. The video is bad. I fell down in a restaurant in front of a camera, and that will follow me for the rest of my career, and I will not pretend otherwise. You can vote me out because of that. Some of you will want to. She looked at Brennan. Or you can vote me back in because I stood up. Because I stood up with the help of a man none of you would have looked at twice if you'd passed him in the street. That's the choice. Take your minute. They didn't take a minute. Brennan called for the vote. 12-2. Sterling was removed from the board by the same instrument he had tried to use against her and escorted from the building by a security detail he had personally approved the budget for the previous quarter. Alara stayed in her chair until the door closed behind him. Then, she let out a breath she had been holding since approximately 7 o'clock. Daniel did not say anything. He only put a hand briefly on the back of her chair and then took it away again. The hallway outside the boardroom was carpeted in something soft and gray, and it was very quiet at 10 minutes past midnight, and Evan was waiting for her on the bench beside the elevators. Nora had brought the children over once the vote was secure. Lily was half asleep against the wall, Daniel's jacket still around her shoulders. Evan was sitting upright with his hands in his lap, the way he had been taught to sit by a nanny Alara had hired and fired without ever learning her first name. He saw his mother. He smiled, and then the smile broke. The fall. The video. The minutes when no one had told him what was happening to her. It had all been waiting underneath the careful surface of a 6-year-old boy, and the boardroom door clicking shut was the small sound that finally let it loose. His breath caught. His shoulders pulled up toward his ears. His thumb went to the second button of his shirt, and his other hand began to count 4 taps. 4 taps. 4 taps against his thigh, faster and faster, the way it had counted the steps from the car to the restaurant when she had not been looking. Mom. Mom. I can't. Mom. Daniel started to move. He stopped himself before his first step landed. He looked at Alara. She understood. She crossed the hallway in 3 strides and knelt in front of her son. The blouse Nora had brought her wasn't made for kneeling, and she did not care. Evan. He could not look at her. Evan, sweetheart. Look at me. His eyes flickered toward hers, and away again. She did not know how to do this. She had never done this. She had outsourced the holding of her son to women in scrubs, and women in cardigans, and women whose names she had not bothered to learn. And now there was no woman in scrubs, and no woman in cardigans, and there was only her, and her son was disappearing inside himself, in a hallway on the 42nd floor of a building she owned. She thought of Daniel on the floor of Lumière. Stay with me, Alara. Open your eyes for me. The hand on the wrist, the voice that did not hurry. She took her son's hand. Evan, baby, breathe with me. In, slow out. In, out. He shook his head. I know, sweetheart. I know it feels like you can't. But you can. Look at me." She squeezed his hand once gently. "Tell me 3 things in this hallway. 3 things you can see." He shook his head again. "1 thing, then." "Just 1. His eyes flickered. The light." "Good. The light. What color?" "Yellow." "Yellow. Good. What else?" The carpet." "What color is the carpet?" "Gray." "Yes, gray. 1 more." He looked at her face for the first time. "You," he whispered. She felt something inside her chest do the thing it had done at the corner table in Lumière, only larger this time and harder, and she did not fight it. "Yes," she said. "Me. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Breathe." He breathed. It was uneven, and it was shallow, and it took a long time. But his shoulders came down. His hand stopped counting. His thumb came away from the button of his shirt. And after a while he leaned forward slowly, as though uncertain whether he was allowed, and put his forehead against her collarbone. His arms went around her neck. Alara held her son in the hallway of her own building for the first time in possibly his entire life, and she did not let go for a very long time. When she finally looked up, Daniel was sitting on the floor beside Lily, watching them with an expression she could not name. He nodded at her once, and she understood it was the same nod she had given Eleanor Harding, the kind of nod that records something without praise and without judgment, but doesn't forget it. 3 days later, Alara called Daniel into her office. She had a contract on the desk. She had spent the morning with 2 attorneys drafting it. It offered him the title of Chief Strategy and Wellness Officer at a compensation package that included equity and a private medical practice space inside the new ground floor of the Voss building, and written into the 3rd clause, at her own insistence, a guaranteed school pickup window between 3 and 4 every weekday. Daniel read it. He read it twice. Then he set it down on her desk, very gently, the way he had set the gauze down at Lumière. "No," he said. She had expected several reactions. That had not been one of them. "Daniel, if I take this job, Alara, I become the proof that money buys everything. I become the man you bought after he was nice to you in a restaurant. I'd be the best version of that man you could possibly build, and I'd still be that man." He looked at her. "And what I gave you the other night, I gave it for free. I'd like to keep it that way." She looked at the contract. She looked at him. "What will you do?" "I'll go back to medicine," Daniel said. "But on my street. There's a clinic in Riverton that's been closed for 4 years because no one wants to run it. I called them yesterday. They'll have me by the end of the month. I'll bring my license back online, and I'll take patients who don't have insurance, and I will be home every night by 6. She watched him for a long moment. Then she pulled the contract toward herself, drew a single line through the entire first page, and turned it over. "Then let me build something else," she said. She did not build it for him. She built it because he had refused her, and the refusal had been the most useful piece of management feedback she had received in 7 years. She called it the Lumière Protocol, and she announced it from the lobby of the Voss Tower the following month in front of a press corps that had spent 4 weeks expecting either her resignation or her arrest. Paid parental leave at full salary for 12 months. A free community medical fund with 3 clinics in 3 counties, of which the Riverton Clinic was the first. An independent medical advisory board chaired by a former trauma physician named Daniel Hayes, who attended quarterly and who took no salary. Eleanor Harding was in the back of the room that day. Alara saw her over the heads of the reporters. The pearls were still there. The expression was not the one she had worn at Lumière. Mrs. Harding lifted her chin slightly as though about to speak. Alara nodded. Once. Small. Not forgiveness. Not war. Mrs. Harding lowered her eyes and slipped out of the room before the questions began. On a Sunday in October, 4 months after the night that had begun with a tug at a sleeve, 4 people walked together through a public park on the east side of the city. The light was the long gold light of late afternoon. Lily walked ahead telling Evan something about horses, and Evan walked beside her, with both hands free. No cuff, no button listening as his mother had once watched Daniel listen. Alara carried a takeout container in one hand. She had bought it from a small Italian place on the corner because Evan had said that morning that he wanted pasta for dinner. She sat down on a bench. She opened the container on her lap. She took the small plastic knife the restaurant had given her, and she began carefully to cut her son's pasta into small, even pieces. Daniel sat down beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he leaned over, looked at her work, and gave her a small sideways smile. "Not bad," he said. "I had a good teacher," Alara replied. Ahead of them, the two children turned back to wave, and the four shadows on the gravel path leaned together in the gold light. And a family that had not existed in the spring stood quietly in the autumn. And the woman who had once believed that power meant never bending down learned finally that the most important thing she would ever build was the small, even act of cutting a piece of pasta for someone she loved.